All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name's Maya Chupkov. Thank you so much, David, for organizing this meeting. And it's been really amazing to kind of see you build this out. And I'm really excited to be here. I lead the media and democracy work at California Common Cause. And I just want to acknowledge all the amazing partners and panelists who helped bring this conversation together. We have Rebuild Local News, the California Independent News Alliance / Mariposa Gazette, and the LA Public Press. Just to give you a little overview of Common Cause in case you don't know about us, our mission is to build a democracy that works for everyone. We do a lot of work in voting rights, strengthening our elections, advancing government accountability, and ensuring that people have access to the information they need to participate in civic life. In our media and democracy work in California, the work is really grounded in understanding that access to reliable, independent, and local information is essential to a functioning democracy. And for those of you who don't know, today is Local News Day, which is a national holiday. And so this event is in honor of that. So yeah, it's a national day of action that brings together hundreds of newsrooms and organizations across the country to reconnect people with their local news. Their call to action is really simple. It's to start local, find your local news, subscribe, and help the people around you do the same. And so as we speak, there's so many events happening and all day. And so it's really exciting that we're able to be a part of it. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge that we really need to, still focus on strengthening and rebuilding our local news because, there have been a lot of strains, a lot of newspaper closures and consolidation threats. And so I'm really excited to kind of hear from all of our panelists so that we can kind of lift up a lot of the amazing work they're doing and really shining a light on the importance of local news and how we can all help out. Before I hand it over to our panelists to introduce themselves, I just want to make a few quick plugs. So I am, in addition to Common Cause, I'm also representing this San Francisco Independent Media Alliance, and we have a few events that are coming up that I just wanted to let everyone know about. We just launched our website, which is really exciting. And so I'm just going to put a few links in the chat. We have a few events coming up. And then the event that I'm most excited about is the coalition is partnering on a impact screenings with Amy Goodman and her film Steal This Story, Please, which is being screened across California. I put the link in the chat. And so, yeah, with that, I will pass it over to our panelists to introduce themselves, and then I will pass it over to David. So, Greg Little, would you like to go first, and then the rest of the panelists can introduce themselves?
Sure. Thank you, Maya. My name is Greg Little. My wife Nicole and I own the Mariposa Gazette. It's the oldest weekly newspaper, founded in 1854. Never missed a publication date in all those years, 172 years now. We bought the paper 8 years ago. So to me, it proves you can make this work. It's a struggle, but you can make it work. I'm also a founding member of the California Independent News Alliance, which is CINA, which was formed about a year and a half ago. Basically, it was kind of almost formed in protest in some ways, but it's an alliance of similar people like us that there are independently owned newspapers in the state of California. We think there's around 200 or so, 230, 40 that fall into that category. We have 100, I think, and 30 members. It's kind of fluctuating. We're just now getting going with. We had our first conference, and we're doing registration and all those kind of things. So, I've been in, and just to wrap it up, I've been in this business 45 years now. Started out as a sports writer in Terre Haute, Indiana, and here I am in Mariposa, California, owning a newspaper. So that's kind of my story right now.
Here, I can go next. Thanks, Greg.
Mhm.
My name's Matt Tinoco. I'm in person in charge of a news publication, but it's a news publication that looks a little bit different. So LA Public Press is it's now 4 years old as an entity. It's a nonprofit local newsroom serving the residents of Los Angeles County. And so one of the intriguing things I think for the folks who are policy minded is that news can come from a variety of different publishers who might have very, very different business backend and business structures, all of which contribute to an overall communications ecosystem for like local news, which basically it's everybody wants local information. For LA Public Press as a more youthful publication, we reach primarily an audience of people who are under 40 in Los Angeles County, where the consumption habits skew towards social media. So we have a nice digital reach of website, but really when it comes to thinking about how to do news, the way different segments of the overall population consume media are very, very heterogeneous. So where in the past one could depend on a single print product to reach basically everybody in a different area or in a single area, our digital ecosystem, as I know we all know and experience, is very, very scattered, which makes publishing place-based local news, which I think is fundamentally the thing that unifies news publishers in California, it can be very challenging. On our end, what that means is basically, so we have our website, we have our email, but also we publish on all different social media platforms, which just takes a lot of human energy to make sure all of the posts are going out. And underneath that, it's the insurance of like, this is actually human verified information. And I look forward to seeing where this conversation goes, but we are organized as a nonprofit and exist mostly off of major grant making, which in Los Angeles County is a viable pathway forward given the scale of regional wealth here. The flip being, not every community looks like Los Angeles County, and that's why this particular discussion is so important. And so I look forward to hearing more from everybody else. Matt Pearce's turn. So there's always another Matt.
There's always multiple Matts. The more that you have a larger group as like a statistical proposition. Anyway, I'm Matt Pearce, Director of Policy for Rebuild Local News. We are a national nonprofit coalition that works on public policies to support community news and information. I'm formerly a longtime staff writer for the LA Times, and I come out of the labor movement. I was the president of our union, co-founded Media Guild of the West, and I've worked on the public policy issues for how to build stronger information communities for the past several years. And that's also, I've worked with Maya from Common Cause in that space for several years. Maya and Common Cause have been great leaders and advocates for what has really blossomed into a movement. You're all here on Local News Day, which is being celebrated in states around the country, and in the public policy space. What we are reacting to is a 75% decline in local journalist employment since 2002. So if you think of quality news, quality information as a public good, it's something where might appear in a newspaper, might appear via Instagram, can come in all sorts of different pathways. The economic incentives to put the work in and hire the people and work on creating the best and most accurate information possible for the public benefit. The economic underpinnings of doing that have been significantly challenged in recent decades. And so part of our argument is that public policy must play a role in helping support quality local news providers like Matt, like Greg, who are doing stories that no one else is doing, providing information that's going to benefit everyone, not just necessarily even the audience for a given publication, because news that travels is never late. And so there are more and more states that are interested in passing laws supporting local news. And California is actually one of the national leaders on this front. It's created the California Local News Fellowship in UC Berkeley several years ago. It's passed a government advertising set-aside policy, which basically means there's a law in the books that is encouraging California state agencies to increase their government advertising spending on community, local news, and ethnic media outlets in California. So it's basically a buy local provision that's now in effect. There is a program that's housed in California GoBiz that's currently in the process of being worked out that would distribute $20 million to newsrooms and news organizations across the state. Ideally, well, I say ideally, it's aiming to give that money out later this year. The rules haven't been fixed for it yet, and I'm working on a bill with Assembly Member Chris Ward of San Diego that's a journalist employment tax credit. So there are all sorts of different ways to direct more resources to support community news organizations. There's not really like one path or one way to do it. It can be kind of technically complicated, but there are First Amendment friendly ways to do it without compromising editorial and press independence, which I know in 2026 is very important to all of us. And there are ways to do it. That's the good news. And there are lawmakers at the state and local level who are interested in engaging in these policies in a very positive and constructive way, and with the support of local advocates such as yourself and people who just care about their communities. So I'm really thrilled to be doing this work, and I'm glad to see that this is actually one place within the local news world where, it's not just doom and gloom sometimes, which is like I was at the LA Times, half the people that I worked with 2 or 3 years ago have lost their jobs, so, and we're talking hundreds of journalists. And so it's very easy to kind of get down about what's happened. But there's so many green shoots, and there are also so many policy opportunities that there's a lot of work that can be done here, and a lot of forward progress that can and is being made right as we speak. But also it will benefit from more folks supporting their community newsrooms that already exist and supporting positive policy solutions that are going to make sure that we keep regenerating what's here and building for the future.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks, all of you. So I'll start out with a question, and of course, any of the four of you can answer, or all four of you can answer, no particular order. And then after that, open it up to questions from the community. But I guess, local news is very important to me for a variety of reasons, which I think may be obvious, but maybe need to be restated a little bit again. But I think most of us here would agree on those. The question might be, how can different groups or different activists across the state, other than subscribing, letting people know, how can they support the future of local news? And maybe what would you like to see happen in the 2026, 2027 to help grow and rebuild local news? So whoever feels like they have something to add to that, please do. And I could ask it again in a
I want
slow.
to know what Greg and Matt think about that, because I'm always like, you should do more policy advocacy because I'm the policy guy. But like, I wonder what that looks like for the news operators. Like, are there ways beyond just subscribing that directly support you?
I think it's a hard question. I mean, as a small newspaper publisher, we rely, but
People say,
thing you can do is buy an ad. I mean, it's so hard. I'm not sure, David, what are you driving at there? I mean,
I could help a little bit, because when you and I first met, you shared some of the community events that are going on, and also about changing how business registrations might need to go into papers and other things like that, that were outside of what I would normally think of.
paper here, I believe, because we're in the mountains, and a lot of people move to the mountains to get away from the rat race and all that. So we've actually grown our circulation in the 8 years we've owned the papers, and we've grown our advertising. So I think it was said earlier in all this, all circumstances are different. I mean, we are still, we still have people line up on Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock when the paper gets here to buy it because they can't wait to get it. We actually sell more on the racks than we do subscriber wise.
Know if that even comes close to answering what you're getting at, but it just shows how different it is everywhere.
Good for me.
I think what I think it requires is realizing that local news is all of ours, which that's easy for me to say as somebody who's like my career before running LA Public Press was working as a reporter covering Los Angeles. I have a very close place attachment here. I'm a fourth generation Angeleno. It is home very deeply. I care for it very deeply, as everybody presumably cares for wherever their roots are. I think for local news, as it manifested in, I'm going to say like the late 20th century, with a revenue model that was the Los Angeles Times was a profoundly rich newspaper. And that is not what the norm has been throughout American history and what press and media actually is within local communities. So what Greg just said, people lining up to get the print edition, like that is it's media is like it's communication infrastructure at a local level. And in our current national ecosystem, all of our media individually is largely produced somewhere else that is not local. We still have local newsrooms, but they are not as deeply rooted as, say, something from, I'm trying to think about like the media ecosystem of 100 years ago or something, because the image of the corporate American newspaper of the 80s, 90s, which there is a lot that we can admire, and I think more that has been lost. Conversely, it's not the only model of what American media can be. There's a book that I like to plug every single time when it comes to being able to imagine what media is, what local news media is, what local communication infrastructure and information sharing is. It's called News for All the People. It is a history of media in the United States, basically from the very beginning. It's written with the assumption of this has been a multiracial country from the beginning. All of these communities have been engaging in some version of media from the very beginning. The book starts in the 1600s in North America. And when I think through the question here as to what can you do to support local media, beyond just like subscribing and sharing, one, that stuff is incredibly important because all of these things, the finances, the material reality of trying to steward a news publication in 2026 is impossible. Nevertheless, we continue trying to do it because those of us who are fortunate enough to work in this direct field professionally are like, we recognize this is important. So I can't understate the value of like the subscribe and share and just helping pass the word along. Like that
Yes.
stuff does really make a difference because maybe you met a new neighbor who recently moved or just I don't know, they have a question about something locally. Like there is something to, hey, remember, there are other resources than just going to Google Gemini at this point and asking something that we really cannot actually trust that it's been verified. So it is this sort of like subscribing and sharing the media and playing an active role in the communication ecosystem that we all individually inhabit. We are all individually trusted information messengers, and what we choose to individually share with our own networks has an effect within those networks. The gap between that and thinking through like what Matt's working on for like public policy is like what we are beginning to try and bridge right now insofar as connecting local media to like all of this other stuff in, for the most part, if we're living in the United States, we inhabit areas with pretty complex government functions that really are poorly understood, even by the people who work in them, candidly. And this is the pause where I'm basically going to say beyond this I don't exactly know, to be entirely honest. Nobody really knows. We are in very deeply uncharted territory, but it does come down to ensuring that we can trust and sustain the existing newsrooms and support new ones that are working hard to address what is really a local information gap. We have more information individually as consumers, but most of it did not come from somebody who lives in the immediate area. And I will pause right here because I want to. There's more thoughts there, but it's a hard question, and like and subscribe is important, but also it's like media trust and sustaining the institutions. So I hope that helped a little bit.
And Matt and or Maya, maybe I could change it a little bit for you, given your policy work. It seems to me that the Facebook, Google monolith has defunded a lot of or taken a lot of money away from journalism. And so I guess what are some legislative or policy things that you're pursuing to help bring some resources, financial resources back?
So the big tech question is one of the most technically complicated and political challenging policy issues that I deal with. It's something I've been working on for several years, and it's been a really mixed bag, to be honest. When I was the union president, we were working on a couple of major bills in California a couple of years ago that would have, one of the concepts was basically create a collective bargaining mechanism between news producers and Google and Meta to require Google and Meta to pay for the content that they're scraping and monetizing from local news outlets. And that was the Assemblymember Wicks bill from a couple of years ago. And then the other one from Senator Steve Glazer, who's now one of our senior advisors, was a data mining mitigation fee, proposing to mine these tech platforms' practice of taking our private information and then targeting advertising to people with it, which has been incredibly profitable. It's just generated a mountain of profits because we've been bartering away our private information to these huge companies that don't have a lot of accountability for us. And that would have funded $500 million a year of local journalist employment tax credits. Both of those bills ultimately failed. There was a much smaller settlement that resulted, which is the California GoBiz civic media program now, which is the $20 million program that is currently getting implemented. I actually just worked on a really interesting law in Utah that just was enacted by the Republicans that lead the state, which is a targeted advertising tax. And it was a fascinating political debate because after the Charlie Kirk assassination in Utah, Governor Spencer Cox was like, we live in an incredibly corrosive information environment. And I think in Utah, the local Republicans feel very strongly that, they want their policies to be oriented toward community and family. And so when they decided to take on big tech in Utah this year, they likened big tech to cigarette companies and said these companies are profiting from our children and selling, harmful content to them. And it's creating all these negative effects that are impacting us in our homes and in our communities. And so we are creating a dedicated revenue stream for programming that would support children's wellness and education in a variety of ways. And our piece was that they also agreed to add dedicated revenue for civic information programs. So they haven't defined what those civic information programs might be yet, but that is the first law in the United States that has created a direct link between the harms created by tech companies to a positive need for funding and supporting civic information.
That's awesome.
So I worked on that this year, and I think that was a pretty encouraging development, but it's early days. There's going to be like a lot of litigation involved in it. And so there's still a question of, whether it can pass all the legal tests that are always coming with anything that challenges big tech in the US. But that conversation is growing. And I think there's a growing awareness among people that, the status quo of how we've set up our information economy is a bit broken. And I think it's manifesting most vividly right now regarding kids' health. But I will say more generally, like the fact that we have highly commercialized way of just relating to the devices in our hands about, and having those be our primary portals through which we learn about our cities, our communities, our neighbors, has had the same kind of corrosive effect on adults. And, it's exploiting also an economic contradiction that just the reality is lies are cheaper to produce than the truth.
Yeah.
And a perfectly rationalized, device and a perfectly rationalized tech platform is going to bring us content that perhaps we're most likely to engage with, but which may not actually be very civically healthy. So this is like an entire realm of very complicated and contentious policy, because there are lots of ways they can go wrong. There are First Amendment considerations that come into play during these conversations, but we do think that having a more balanced technological environment is going to be necessary in order to create sustainable conditions for local news and information providers, because I mean the rise of AI is going to complicate this. There's not just a theft effect that happens if an AI scrapes local news content to create its own summaries, but there's a competition effect. People are no longer connecting with the real providers of the original information, which means it's harder for those providers to monetize it either through subscriptions, through advertising, through philanthropy. If you go to your funders and say, here's how many people we managed to connect with this year. If those numbers go down because audiences are going to AI to get your information, that destroys the incentives to invest more resources into quality information production. So we have to break that dynamic that undercuts the incentives to produce accurate information, which is, the source of a lot of the maladies around us.
Great points. Anyone else from the panel want to answer anything? Or Maya, if you want to chime in, just come off mute anytime, but I don't want to. All right, so let's take some questions. I think everybody has been here before, or most everybody's been here before. Just try and encourage people to keep it to a question rather than promotion of a project or a long point of view. So just concise questions so we can get as more people to ask questions want. Of course, there's no pressure to ask questions. Just raise your hand, either your real live hand or your Zoom hand, if anyone has one. Farzam, go ahead.
Hi everyone, thanks for putting this together. So one question to Matt and whoever else that's going to chime in. You mentioned about the reduction in the local news kind of staff. It's a pretty scary number from 2022 up to now. And I was wondering, like, well, obviously the social networks and the digitization of the whole thing is kind of has a lot to do with it. What were some of the other effects that kind of caused that? Was that like acquisitions by larger publications from local news, or what were the other things other than, I mean, funding obviously and advertising and things like that? So if you could just talk about that a little bit more.
I can take a stab at this. My union, Media Guild of the West, we unionized a bunch of different newsrooms of all different types. We had big, little, commercial, nonprofit. The really interesting ones, we unionized chains that were owned by Alden Global Capital, which used to be a hedge fund. It's now just a family office, to use a finance term. McClatchy, which is owned by Chatham Asset Management, which is a hedge fund. We had Gannett, which is a publicly traded company. And it was interesting because the big corporate commercial chains, basically owned by Wall Street, were very challenging to negotiate with, but they were also very challenging to rabble rouse against because they weren't locally based. I mean, a very, very, very basic rule of thumb for local media is that having local ownership or local control is likelier to be associated with higher journalist employment in the given newsroom that you're talking about. But like one of the like very paradoxical effects that, if I were to turn this around and express it sort of like an econ 101. Like this is a sector where economically costs are growing faster than revenues do. And so like for the econ nerds on this call, and I don't know if there are econ nerds on this call, but like within marginal economics, which is like the dominant tool of management economics, since like the 1870s, like the way that companies figure out whether they increase or decrease production is like if you add one person or one unit, does your profit go up or does it go down? And for like most of the sector, if you add a person, that means your profit goes down. And so we have this dynamic where the finance-backed local news organizations are the ones basically doing calculus for what their profit curves look like and are figuring out that it's more profitable to lay off reporters because of this larger dynamic where if you add more journalists, the revenues are not going to keep up with the costs. And so you have this dynamic where the commercial part of the sector is just laying off because that's where the like broader environment is going. And then we have our good guys who are trying to increase news production, but they're running into this invisible ceiling of the more journalists that they add, the more it is starting to cut into the cash that they would have to improve their operations. And so they're like running into this and struggling to grow, which means that the only pathway for growth left is either philanthropy or public subsidies. So that's what we're trying to do to like increase output. But like that to me is like in economic terms, the whole story of what's going on and why it's been so damaging to have financialized owners in the sector, because they're doing the math basically to maximize profit, and it's telling them to lay people off.
Yeah, that makes good sense. Any of the other panelists want to chime in on that, or we can take another question? So,
if I can just follow up on that. So it seems from what you're saying, it's pretty much comes to whether it's running as a business or as a public service. And that's the sticky point. I'll just leave it at there to leave.
It's the whole crisis. We have these private businesses that are producing public goods.
Yeah. And I saw Lauren had a question, but she turned her camera off. So Lauren, if you're here and want to ask your question, come back on.
Yeah, I can come back. I turned my camera off because I lowered my hand because it's a bit of a nitty-gritty question. But Greg, I'm so curious if you could speak a little bit more to your strategy for selling so many like physical newspapers off the racks like you were describing, and kind of like if you do any marketing for that, or like what about your environment there makes that a reality?
Well, we don't do any marketing. So we've had, there have been racks in the stores here for decades, literally. And obviously our biggest one is it's a grocery store. We have one grocery store, but we don't really have a strategy. It's just that people here are hungry to get their news and they want to know what's going on. I am old school. I am very old school. And, they were talking about the corporate mentality. Well, number one, the corporate mentality doesn't care about journalism. They don't. Even when I was coming up in this business, even the publishers then, and some of them were quite wealthy because they got every car ad, every ad you could get. They had vacations home, but they had journalism in their blood. And these people don't, and they don't care. We're a different animal. A newspaper is a different animal. It's not like a grocery store or a gas station or anything like that. We're in many ways a public business, although we're a private profit company, but we put everything out there. And I think the people here, as I said, I'm old school. When we bought this paper, we went back to covering sports, covering education, covering local news, having an opinion page, and all that kind of thing. So I think going back to the old school has helped us do It's funny. We're sitting here right now, and there's a girl who graduated from high school here. I've just written three stories about who came here. She's filming a TV pilot here, and she's looking in my window. I mean, we go back to that. That's the kind of stuff you got to cover that the people want. And I think the bigger paper, or not the bigger even, the corporate papers have just gone away from that. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Great answer.
I kind of wanted to add a little bit because that hunger for information is the thing that I think if we're all here on this call talking about local news, like we all recognize the hunger for information. And it's that hunger for information which is so integral to figure out how to ensure that when people are actually out looking for information, that our media platforms are easily accessible. And so, Greg, at the grocery store with the physical media right there is a very excellent way to actually reach people. The reach people where they are is overused, but like it is what it is when it comes to media. And so just ensuring that our like the information is actually accessible and being intentional and thinking through like how do I make sure that our information is accessible in whatever environment, audience, community, geography, whatever that we are trying to serve. And then that's the area where it's basically making it as low barrier as possible to access, which is challenging in an ecosystem that we do not control or own. It is mediated by the technology platforms. And so that's where then it is beginning to like we do a fair amount of offline stuff, although all of our publication is it's social media and digital based. The real value of like basically printing stuff out and printing little like things, it is a very important moment for basically establishing audience trust. If you can present somebody a printed out piece of media of some of our online of our work, and match that with a human conversation, it becomes basically a trusted entry into at LA Public Press, which is the online brand. So like literacy and legibility is important in a very confusing ecosystem. But the whole like thing about this is that the hunger for news is off the charts, and I think that is just going to continue increasing. And so that's the bit that gives me quite a bit of hope. Just the last thing I'll say is that on like LA Public Press, it's a relatively young publication. It's 4 years, but 25 was a very, very significant inflection year for our newsroom's audience development. So the two major LA events being the January wildfires, as well as then the beginnings of the entire ice apparatus in June. And we saw really crazy audience spikes in those both of those moments simply because the number of people looking for information was very, very high. Information about very specific things that we were able to meet in that particular moment. And then by being a social media first publication, we could or not always, but in those particular moments, it means that when people are going onto Instagram and searching something about LA fires, we already have the media there ready. And so that was that's the old school journalistic, like, gotta get the thing into print fast. Like, that stuff is still incredibly important in this ecosystem. It's just different tools and different mediums. But, like, that's why I'm like, it's these old neighborly connections and connections to place that, like, are going to continue sustaining it because people want to know. Like, and people know that their information, like, most, I think, people who incredibly broad strokes this language, but like what I think people are generally media savvy and are thoughtful about the average American watching broadcast television is probably going to have some opinion about broadcast television that most other people are probably going to agree about with whatever story is presented. Like we can see through the narratives, but like that's just we want to find stuff that's accurate underneath it all.
Thank you. So, is there anyone who hasn't asked a question who'd like to ask one? And of course, the panel can all ask questions too. So Matt, you dropped something in the chat. I didn't see Matt Tinoco. You dropped something in the chat about civic education, and we've talked several times about the importance of local journalism towards understanding government accountability and things like that. Obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously. One of my things is to drive civic education so that people understand what's going on at the local and state level more than they do now, to give them more hunger for the sort of information you're all talking about, helping to create demand. I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on what might be taught to public either in K through 12 or college or post college to help them understand how local journalism could benefit them. And feel free to go off on a different tangent if that question makes no relevance to you. So,
David, if I may actually add to your question just a little bit, I was going to ask more or less the same question because I am an environmental science teacher at the community college level, and I would very much love to know the panel and the group's thoughts on how we can engage, especially as Matt mentioned in a comment, that intersection between media literacy and critical thinking, especially at the kind of age range that I particularly teach, that kind of 18, 19 age range. But if you have thoughts for high school and stuff as well, I'd love to hear that.
I think the concept of primary source is super important. If we can isolate to like a specific actionable that you can teach people how to find, I think that's like, where did the information actually originate? Because Google Gemini is not the original information source. The local newspaper might not be the original information source, but hopefully it's able to attribute what the original source of the information is. I think that's an easier way to talk about this than critical thinking generally, even though I think just find the primary information source, whether that's a scientific study in environmental science or whatever. That's born out of experience having worked as a fact checker for Mother Jones magazine. And the job was go through every single word in a story and corroborate it externally with an external source of independently, where I'm making my own judgment call to be like, is this the primary source for this information? Is what the reporter's saying accurate? Yes, great, fact checked. That skill set is, I think that's really that's kind. It's I don't it shouldn't it, I don't think the news industry is positioned to teach that skill in its constrained environment. Both my parents are teachers for what it's worth. I think that is within the education system zone. But like it is, I think it's fine, the primary source. That's just the practical little thing.
This question reminds me, I recently heard a presentation on a study. It was out of France. The economist Julia Cage ran a test with French high school students, 3,000 high school students, where they gave them free subscriptions to one of the French newspapers, and then they studied the effect on media literacy for the students and awareness of news events and also what they were consuming. And so interestingly, the findings from her research was that a free subscription, of course, like increased the amount that they were going to that news source and getting the news from that news source. It increased their news literacy. Increased awareness of news events, especially for lower income students, which was the particular effect that they found. And then interestingly, it did not decrease news consumption from like creator news sources, which is where a lot of young people get information now. But it did decrease consumption of crap, basically. So I think that was a really interesting intervention. And so in our policy work, we haven't really worked on anything like high school or college level, like subscription policies. But I do know like high schools and colleges sometimes have subscription programs for, certain news outlets and use that as a tool to try to promote some civic awareness among students. But like, it's an interesting avenue for exploration and really like, teaching young people how to be skeptical of what they see is just going to be a skill that they're going to need for their entire life, as you know, from all your work. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting possibilities there.
Great. Pause to see if there's any other responses, but okay, how about other questions? Hi, Kirsten, didn't see you, sorry.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, thank you so much for all that you're doing. Everyone on the panel has been really helpful to understand where the problems are. I'm in Santa Cruz, California, and there are some local news outlets that have started here. They're nonprofits. They have very clear missions, and a group of people even left the Santa Cruz Sentinel to, start a nonprofit news outlet, and that's going very well for them. So really interesting movement. I'm asking, I know there's been some reference to the kind of the commons and how news infrastructure fits in that. I mean, I think one of the emerging effects of the corporate capitalism crisis that we're in is a growing focus on the commons. People have a desire in their communities to participate in more decision making around what the commons infrastructure is funded by their tax dollars. And I just was wondering if you have any further thoughts about how media and journalism and local news outlets are being considered commons infrastructure, and how people can advocate for that locally, or at the state level, or even nationally. Is that an effort that you're seeing, among foundations or other funders, or among city and county governments? Like, where are you seeing that coming to life? Thank you.
I want to tap in Maya and make her answer this one because I feel like she probably has something good to say.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And that is honestly like my favorite thing to talk about is like how can we have like a bigger vision of what our like what I call like our public interest media ecosystem, and how that can help bring people together to find to find commonality. I was just on a panel with Intersection for the Arts, the Association of Libraries, and the Future Film Coalition, and we were talking about how these like larger institutions like libraries, museums, and like a lot of these places that offer these common spaces for people to access, for like oftentimes for free, and how can that become spaces where we can cultivate civic life and bring people together from different cultures, and having people you know have more space to like process news in real time, because feel like with news it can often be like a singular experience, like you read an article and then you're kind of digesting it, and then maybe you move on with your day. But I think what a lot of these cultural institutions can offer is like a place for like deeper processing of news that's happening. And I think journalists are definitely should be part of those, and filmmakers. Like I'm working on a documentary, and so I feel like a lot of what's on my mind is around how film can be used. There was an amazing investigative article in the LA Times a few years ago exposing what like these barrels were thrown in the ocean, and there was a documentary that kind of was able to extend the life of that article in a lot of ways. And so it's called Out of Plain Sight. And so that's just like an example of how, I think the more we can think of, a lot of these different ways we access and process information, and really taking the time to have these stories have a longer lifespan, can be really helpful when it comes to just building community, and having people feel like they belong more, and having news not be such an isolating and singular experience. So
That's awesome. I never thought of that. How innovative. So Julie, I'm going to let you ask the last question. We're going to wrap up in about 6 minutes. And
Super
Hi.
quick. I really like that last point. First of all, this has been great. Thank you to everybody. Very, very just thought-provoking, compelling, good information. I think the two-wayness of our need to make meaning out of the world and belonging and some of the other things you mentioned is just a really important point. And I think for some of us, in my experience, for some of us working at the local level, trying to strengthen civic infrastructure, it really does tie to this because people are, as many of you have said, longing for good information, want to understand things. Granted, it may be from particular perspectives, but how we kind of connect the dots a little more with some of this feels like one of the challenges for one of us. So for all of us working on this. So I guess my question might be, are there any great examples that people might lift up? Because I think that may be the next frontier of how we save ourselves and each other while getting good information and doing the things Greg was talking about, the things that matter to people locally, but really understanding the more macro big issues. It feels like we're talking about a lot of different things, and good examples on that feel important. So
That'd be great.
that
And
was more of a statement maybe than a question, but thank you.
it's still great. So yeah, just encourage anyone who wants to answer, and if after that, just maybe some closing thoughts. But we do have to stay on time today to wrap up in 5 minutes. So just a reminder to keep it brief.
I think there is the local connection of seeing in-person engagement is really important. The digital ecosystem is how all the information spreads at this point. But for that, I suppose, mirroring or resonance that you're describing, Julie, it does really hinge on having in-person. Like it's just better. And I know COVID is still like I mean, we're here on Zoom, and so this is a wonderful way to do this. But the inverse is that within our own environments, I do think the in-person stuff really matters. And that really does come down to just knowing your neighbors in the sort of raw sense. And then, yeah, mindful of the time. Oh, the one little detail I wanted to add on this for our ecosystem for the erosion of the commons. Where we are right now is on the national scale. CBS, CNN, and TikTok are effectively being rolled into the same company, which is disastrous for our general public square. The inverse of that is that I think about like the Southern news media during the civil rights movement, where the public discussion was you're going to have a segregationist newspaper, you're going to have a black newspaper, and then you're going to have the white moderate newspaper that will kind of both sides it at the beginning and then gradually stop. And those are in like a small town of 30,000 people. Everybody participating in all of that writing is in a single environment and would end up seeing each other daily just at the general store or whatever. And that's like just in terms of thinking about American media history beyond just right now, there's so many different versions of it that are important to remember that we do not have to just accept that our entire ecosystem is CNN, CBS, and TikTok, and that's all one company. So it is a lot of work to do, and I'll pause here, but thank you for inviting me along, and this has been a fun discussion for me.
Thanks, Matt. Greg, any last thoughts?
Well, I think what was just said in person, this is going to sound almost Mayberry-ish, but we still participate in, we have a float in the parade, here. We sponsor our little league and softball teams. We still do those kind of things, even though it impacts the bottom line. That, because coaches of softball teams own businesses and advertise. I think we've gone away from that community connection, even in big cities. I know big cities are like small communities all kind of put together, but you got to then be in touch with the public. And, we go into the classrooms and talk about the newspaper. We even produced a newspaper at the school in Yosemite National Park. For 5 years, we produced one. So I think it's that, just to wrap up, that's in-person human connections You can have all the AI and Googles you want, but you'll still never change that, in my opinion.
Thank you. It's awesome. Matt Pearce, you.
Um, I would just want to say thank you all for caring enough to come and have this discussion. I mean, I am a huge believer in collective power, coming out of the labor movement, and you know, this is a nation of joiners, and part of the function of media is to gather the wandering lights, as Alexis de Tocqueville put it a long time ago, and allow people to engage meaningfully with this democratic experiment that we have. In that light, in a very practical way, I'm sticking our website in the chat here, Rebuild Local News. If you want to just read up on what we do on the public policy level, subscribe to the newsletter for updates. Please contact your state lawmaker and just tell them to support any and all media policy that comes their way. There's actually like a menu of things that they can do right now. That's one of the upshots in California. We just need lawmakers who care about these issues enough to ask questions and have opinions, and hopefully want to vote for things that we can enact and make good public policy, and then keep experimenting and go with what works. So thank you so much for listening to us yak about it, and it's really our pleasure to be doing this.
And
Yes.
Maya, you want the last word?
Sure. So yeah, I'll just highlight two examples that I feel like it touches more on like visual media than journalism, but as someone who's making a film, I'm just trying to make a plug for the visual media as much as I can. This museum is such a great example of like space where you can like process a lot of history of our country through a lot of different forms of media, from like journalism to documentary to exhibits, and then this program out of Maine is a state funded program to help address the opioid crisis in the state, and it gives people in Maine money to produce films around the opioid crisis, and so if there's an issue that y'all really care about, I feel like these models can be replicated, and we could even do one in partnership with local journalism. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you all for giving up time on a busy day. I know you got a lot going on, but appreciate you sharing all these resources. And Matt Pearce and Maya, I'll talk to you about those bills that maybe we can help push out and get more people to support. And thanks everyone for coming. I'll share the video and the links, and see you all soon, hopefully.
Thank you.